"My papa died today. Can we stay in your stable tonight?" The 8-year-old girl's voice cracked through the Texas wind like a broken prayer, her bare feet bleeding on the wooden porch of a man who had once painted his face for war. Benjamin Iron Eagle looked down at the child clutching her unconscious mother's torn dress, and in that moment, a Comanche warrior's heart remembered what it meant to protect the innocent. Texas Panhandle, late September 1881. The sun hung low and angry over the endless grassland, casting long shadows across a land that had seen too much blood and too many broken promises. Adobe Wells sat 20 miles east, a dusty settlement where former enemies now traded goods and uneasy truces. Between the town and the vast emptiness stood a modest ranch, its weathered buildings testament to one man's attempt to forge peace. From the ashes of war.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Benjamin Iron Eagle stood, 6 feet tall with shoulders that had once carried a war lance, but now bore the weight of different battles. At 44, silver streaked his long black hair, which he wore loose in the old way, despite the disapproving looks from townspeople. His face, carved by sun and sorrow, bore scars from conflicts that textbooks would never record accurately. Deep brown eyes that had once searched horizons for cavalry dust now watched over cattle and horses with the same intensity his ancestors had reserved for buffalo herds. The ranch itself told the story of a man caught between two worlds. Traditional Comanche. Tippis stood alongside a sturdy log cabin, symbols of a heritage he refused to abandon, even as he adapted to a new way of life. Corrals built with his own hands contained mustangs that still ran wild in their hearts, much like their owner. A vegetable garden, carefully tended, grew beside native plants his grandmother had taught him to harvest for medicine and ceremony. This was neither fully white man's civilization nor the nomadic life of his youth, but something entirely his own. Benjamin had been born in 1837, when the Comanche nation ruled the southern plains like lords of an endless kingdom. His father, Chief Iron Eagle, had led their band through the golden years when buffalo darkened the prairies and no white man dared cross Comanche territory without permission. Benjamin learned to ride before he could walk properly, to shoot a bow before he could read English, to track game across terrain that would confuse a surveyor. By 16, he had counted coup against enemy tribes and earned his adult name through deeds that would become whispered legends. But the world changed with devastating swiftness. The Civil War brought new pressures as both Union and Confederate forces sought Comanche alliances. The buffalo began disappearing, not from natural cycles but from systematic slaughter by hide hunters who left carcasses rotting under the sun. Settlers pushed westward in unprecedented numbers, backed by an army that had learned brutal efficiency in 4 years of fraternal warfare. The proud Comanche nation found itself increasingly surrounded, increasingly desperate. Benjamin fought in the last great raids, striking back against encroachment with the fury of a people watching their world die. He rode with Quanah Parker in battles that would be remembered as the final gasps of Comanche resistance. His war paint red and black stripes across his cheekbones, white dots marking enemy scalps taken, became known to cavalry officers who carried his description in wadded posters. For 3 years, from 1871 to 1874, Benjamin Iron Eagle was considered one of the most dangerous men on the southern plains. The end came not in glorious battle, but in the slow starvation of Palo Duro Canyon. General Mackenzie's soldiers destroyed everything: horses, food stores, weapons, shelter. Benjamin watched his people, once lords of the prairie, reduced to eating bark and hiding in caves like hunted animals. When Chief Iron Eagle finally led the survivors to the reservation at Fort Sill, his son felt something die inside his chest that had nothing to do with physical wounds. Reservation life proved worse than death for a man raised to roam free across endless grassland. The Indian agents treated grown warriors like children, doling out rancid beef and moldy flour while preaching about civilization and Christianity. Benjamin watched elders who had counted coup against mountain lions waste away from despair and disease. Children who should have been learning to read the sky and track game were forced into boarding schools where they were beaten for speaking their own language. In 1878, after 4 years of slow suffocation, Benjamin made a decision that shocked both his people and the white authorities. He requested permission to leave the reservation legally, to purchase land and live as a rancher under white man's law. The Indian agent, a nervous man named Caldwell, who feared Benjamin's reputation, was initially suspicious. But the request came with an unusual offer. Benjamin would serve as an intermediary between the reservation and local ranchers, helping to prevent the cattle rustling and horse theft that plagued the region. The land Benjamin purchased with money earned from his work as a scout and translator lay in a valley that had once been a favorite camping spot for his band. A creek ran through it year-round, cottonwoods provided shade and windbreak, and the grass grew thick enough to support both cattle and horses. More importantly, it was far enough from adobe wells that he could live according to his own customs, without constant interference, yet close enough to maintain the fragile peace he had negotiated with local authorities. For 3 years, Benjamin had lived this hybrid existence, successful enough to earn grudging respect from neighboring ranchers, traditional enough to maintain his identity as a Comanche warrior. He traded horses with former enemies, sold beef to the same army that had once hunted him, and slowly built something resembling prosperity. But prosperity, he learned, was a poor substitute for purpose. The ranch thrived, but Benjamin's heart remained as empty as the plains where buffalo no longer roamed. His evenings were spent in solitude, reading by lamplight in a cabin that felt too small for a man accustomed to sleeping under infinite stars. He had taught himself to read English fluently, devouring newspapers, agricultural journals, and books on animal husbandry. Knowledge was power in this new world, and Benjamin Iron Eagle had always been a quick learner. But all the reading in the world could not fill the silence left by the absence of family, of the children he had never had, of the woman he had never found time to love during the war years. The neighboring ranchers maintained polite distance, their courtesy tainted by the nervousness that came from living near a man whose reputation had once struck fear into cavalry officers. They bought his horses because the animals were superior to anything available elsewhere. They respected his knowledge of the land and weather, but they never invited him to their homes or included him in their social gatherings. Benjamin existed in a strange limbo, too dangerous to ignore, too useful to shun, too different to accept. On this particular evening, September 23, 1881, Benjamin sat on his front porch as was his custom, watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of red and gold that reminded him of war paint. The newspaper in his lap carried disturbing news from back east. President Garfield had died from his assassin's bullet, and the country seemed poised for more upheaval. Closer to home, drought threatened the region's cattle, and tensions between ranchers and remaining Comanche bands continued to simmer despite official peace treaties. His horses, grazing in the near pasture, suddenly lifted their heads in unison, ears pricked toward the eastern trail. Benjamin's warrior instincts, dulled by 3 years of peaceful ranching, sharpened instantly. Someone was approaching, and from the horse's nervous behavior, something was wrong. He rose from his chair with fluid grace, automatically checking the Colt revolver at his hip, a concession to the new world that sat uneasily beside the traditional knife his grandfather had given him. The sound reached him, then a woman's voice, cracked with exhaustion and desperation, calling out words he could not yet distinguish. Benjamin stepped off the porch and walked toward the sound, his moccasined feet silent on the packed earth. Years of tracking had taught him to read stories in the dust, and what he saw in the failing light made his jaw tighten with anger. 2 sets of footprints,
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
One adult woman and one small child, both barefoot and unsteady. The woman's prints showed she was favoring her left leg, possibly injured. The child's tracks wandered erratically, suggesting exhaustion or fear. But it was the third set of prints, following roughly parallel to theirs, but staying hidden in the brush that made Benjamin's hand move instinctively to his weapon. Someone had been tracking them, someone who did not want to be seen. As he rounded the bend where his trail met the main road, Benjamin saw them. A young woman stumbled forward, her dress torn and stained with dust and what looked like dried blood. Her blonde hair, once probably arranged in the careful curls favored by white women, now hung in tangles around a face marked by exhaustion and fear. But it was the child beside her that made Benjamin's breath catch in his throat. The little girl could not have been more than 8 years old, with hair the color of prairie grass and eyes that seemed far too old for her small face. Her dress, probably once a cheerful blue, was now the color of dust and desperation. Her feet were bare and bleeding from walking on rough ground, and she clung to her mother's hand with the fierce grip of someone who had already lost too much to risk losing more. The woman looked up as Benjamin approached, and he saw the moment when recognition and terror warred in her eyes. She knew what he was: the long hair, the moccasins, the way he moved like a predator even in peaceful intent. In her condition, exhausted and protecting a child, the appearance of a Comanche warrior probably seemed like a cruel joke played by a merciless god. But desperation overcame fear. The woman stopped walking and faced Benjamin directly, her chin raised in the kind of defiant courage that reminded him of female warriors from his own people. When she spoke, her voice carried the flat accent of farmers from farther east. People who had come west, seeking land and opportunity, but found only hardship and loss. "Please, sir," she said, the words carrying more weight than a treaty negotiation. "My name is Margaret Harper. This is my daughter, Annabeth. We've been walking for 2 days. My husband," her voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. "My husband died yesterday. We have nowhere else to go. We saw your light from the road. I know you don't know us, but could we possibly stay in your stable tonight? Just one night. We won't be any trouble." Benjamin studied the woman, Margaret Harper, with the same intensity he had once reserved for reading enemy intentions. She was younger than he had first thought, probably no more than 26 or 27, with the kind of pale skin that spoke of recent arrival in Texas. Her hands, visible where she gripped her daughter's fingers, were soft but showed recent calluses, suggesting she was unused to hard labor, but had been doing it anyway. Most telling were her eyes, green as spring grass, but haunted by fresh grief and the kind of fear that came from having no choices left. The child, Annabeth, stepped slightly forward, and Benjamin saw in her small face the same fierce protectiveness her mother displayed. When she spoke, her voice was clear despite the tears that threatened to spill down her dirt-streaked cheeks. "My papa died today," she said with the stark honesty that only children possess. "He got bit by a snake trying to fix our wagon wheel. Mama couldn't make him better. Can we stay in your stable tonight? We don't eat very much." The words hit Benjamin like a physical blow. In Comanche culture, children were sacred, protected by the entire tribe regardless of their parentage. The idea of any child begging for shelter while her father lay dead somewhere on the prairie violated every principle by which he had been raised. But more than cultural obligation, something in Annabeth's courage reminded him of his younger sister, lost to cavalry bullets in a raid 15 years earlier. Benjamin looked from mother to child, then beyond them to the darkening prairie, where threats both human and natural waited for the unwary. The tracks he had seen told him their story was true. No one faked that kind of exhaustion, that level of desperation. And something else. The parallel tracks following them had stopped about a quarter-mile back, as if whoever had been pursuing them had given up or decided to wait for a better opportunity. "You are not staying in any stable," Benjamin said. Quietly, his English carrying only the faint accent that marked him as someone for whom it was a second language. "You will come inside, both of you. There is food and beds and safety." Margaret Harper's eyes widened in surprise that quickly turned to suspicion. In her experience, men, especially men with reputations like the one she probably assumed Benjamin carried, did not offer charity without expecting something in return. Her grip on Annabeth's hand tightened protectively. "Sir, I appreciate the kindness, but we couldn't impose. The stable would be fine. We have a blanket, and Annabeth is used to sleeping rough. We've been on the trail for 3 months now. Coming from Kansas, we can manage one more night." Benjamin stepped closer, and Margaret instinctively stepped back, pulling Annabeth with her. The movement sparked something in Benjamin's memory, his own mother, protecting him and his siblings from drunken soldiers at a trading post. That same fierce maternal instinct that recognized danger even when it came disguised as help. "Mrs. Harper," he said, deliberately using her formal name to show respect. "I am Benjamin Iron Eagle. This is my ranch, my home. In my people's tradition, children and their mothers are sacred. You have asked for shelter, and it is given freely, with no conditions and no obligations. But you will not sleep in a stable while I have beds empty in my house." Annabeth tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered something that Benjamin's sharp hearing caught. "Mama, he has kind eyes. Like Papa did." Margaret looked down at her daughter, then back at Benjamin. In the fading light, she seemed to be weighing impossible choices, the known danger of spending the night exposed on the prairie against the unknown risk of accepting help from a man whose very presence challenged everything she had been taught about Indians, about safety, about the world itself. "Mr. Iron Eagle," she said finally, her voice carrying the careful courtesy of someone walking on thin ice, "we would be grateful for your hospitality. But I want you to know we have nothing to pay you with. My husband's death left us with nothing but what we carry." Benjamin smiled for the first time in longer than he could remember, an expression that transformed his weathered features and revealed the man he might have been in a world without war and loss. "Mrs. Harper," he said, gesturing toward the warm light spilling from his cabin windows, "you have already given me something more valuable than money. You have given me the chance to remember what it means to be needed. Welcome home." As he led them toward the house, Annabeth slipped her small hand into his large, scarred one with the trusting gesture of a child who recognized safety when she found it. Behind them, the Texas night settled over the prairie like a blanket, hiding whatever dangers might still lurk in the darkness. But for the first time in 3 years, Benjamin Iron Eagle's house would not echo with the hollow sound of loneliness. The warrior had found his purpose again, and it looked like a frightened woman and a brave little girl who had chosen to trust him when they had no other choice. The interior of Benjamin Iron Eagle's cabin defied every expectation Margaret Harper had formed during their walk from the porch. Instead of the sparse, primitive dwelling she anticipated, she found herself in a space that seamlessly blended two worlds with startling sophistication. Hand-carved furniture set beside traditional Comanche artifacts, while books in both English and what she assumed was the Comanche language-lined shelves made from native cedar. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel decorated with eagle feathers, brass trinkets, and a photograph of a Comanche war party that made her breath catch. Benjamin moved through his home with quiet efficiency, lighting oil lamps that cast warm golden light across walls adorned with both painted buffalo hides and framed maps of Texas territory. Margaret noticed how he moved silent as smoke, every gesture deliberate and economical, like a man who had spent years where a careless sound could mean death. Yet his actions toward them carried a gentleness that spoke of deep-rooted honor. And respect for the vulnerable. Sit, he said, gesturing toward a sofa covered in what appeared to be hand-woven blankets of extraordinary craftsmanship. Annabeth looks ready to fall over, and you are not much steadier on your feet. Margaret helped her daughter onto the soft cushions, marveling at how the child immediately curled up like a small animal finally finding safety. Annabeth's eyes drooped with exhaustion, but she fought sleep with the determination of someone who had learned that letting down her guard could be dangerous. Her small fingers clutched at her mother's torn sleeve, anchoring herself to the one constant in her rapidly changing world. Benjamin knelt beside the fireplace, his movements revealing the powerful shoulders and steady hands of a man accustomed to physical labor. As flames began to dance among the carefully arranged logs, Margaret found herself studying her unlikely host with growing confusion. Everything she thought she knew about Indian stories of savagery, primitiveness, inability to adapt to civilized ways crumbled against the evidence of her own eyes. "You read," she said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment at her own surprise. Benjamin looked up from the fire, one eyebrow raised in what might have been amusement. "I do many things that might surprise you, Mrs. Harper. Reading is perhaps the least remarkable. Among them," he gestured toward the bookshelves, "knowledge is the most powerful weapon a man can carry. My enemies taught me that when they used their superior knowledge of firearms, tactics, and politics to defeat my people." Margaret's face burned with shame at her own assumptions. "I apologize. I did not mean to suggest you meant exactly what you said," Benjamin interrupted, but his tone carried no anger. "You have been taught that my people are ignorant savages incapable of civilization. It is what your newspapers print, what your politicians preach, what your children learn in school. The surprise is not that you believed it, but that you are willing to reconsider when faced with contrary evidence." He rose from the fireplace and moved to a cabinet, retrieving items with practiced efficiency. Margaret watched as he assembled supplies for what appeared to be a substantial meal, not the scrap she might have expected, but ingredients for a feast that spoke of hospitality ingrained at the deepest cultural level. "Tell me about your husband," Benjamin said as he worked, his back turned to give her privacy for grief if she needed it. "How did he die, and where?" Margaret's hands clenched in her lap, and she glanced down at Annabeth, who had finally succumbed to exhaustion and lay sleeping against her mother's side. The child's face, relaxed in sleep, looked impossibly young and vulnerable, a stark reminder of the responsibility that now rested entirely on Margaret's shoulders. "Thomas was a good man," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "A farmer from Kansas. We lost our crop 2 years running drought, then locusts, then drought again. He heard there was land available in Texas, good soil, a chance to start over. We sold everything we had left and bought a wagon. Supplies started the journey south with 3 other families." Benjamin continued his food preparation, but Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his movements became more controlled. He was listening to every word, reading between the lines with the skill of someone accustomed to extracting truth from incomplete information. "The other families turned back after we crossed into Indian territory," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger as she found her rhythm. "They said it was too dangerous, that the army could not protect us if we went farther west. But Thomas, he was stubborn, said we had come too far to quit, that Annabeth deserved better than the poverty we were running from." She paused, reaching down to stroke her daughter's hair with infinite tenderness. "We made it across the Red River, found a good spot near what the map called Sweetwater Creek. Thomas was so excited. The soil was rich. There was water year-round, enough timber for building. He said it was like God had saved the best land for people brave enough to claim it." Benjamin turned from his work, his dark eyes reflecting firelight and something deeper understanding born of his own losses, his own difficult choices. "What happened to him?" Margaret's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks as she relived the moment that had shattered her world. 3 days ago, he was fixing a broken wheel on our wagon. The ground was soft, near the creek, and when he reached under the wagon bed to retrieve a tool, a rattlesnake struck him on the forearm. The bite was deep. The snake was large. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks in the dust that coated her face. I tried everything I knew, cut the wound, sucked out what poison I could, made poultices from plants I recognized. But the swelling kept spreading, and by the second day, he was burning with fever. He died yesterday morning, just as the sun was coming up. Benjamin moved to the stove, ladling stew into wooden bowls, with the kind of steady hands that suggested. He had dealt with death many times and understood its weight. You buried him alone? I could not dig deep enough, Margaret admitted, her voice thick with guilt and exhaustion. The ground was too hard, and I had only a small shovel. I covered him with rocks, said what prayers I could remember. Annabeth picked wildflowers to put on the grave. She said Papa would like the pretty colors. The child stirred at the mention of her name, opening eyes that were startlingly blue in her dirt-streaked face. She looked around the cabin with the quick assessment of someone much older than her 8 years, taking in the warmth, the safety, the smell of food cooking. "Mama," she said softly, "are we safe now?" Margaret looked toward Benjamin, uncertainty clear in her expression. "I think so, sweetheart. Mr. Iron Eagle has been very kind to us." Annabeth sat up straighter, studying their host with the direct gaze that only children possess. "Are you really an Indian, like the ones in the stories?" Benjamin knelt beside the sofa, bringing himself to eye level with the child. "I am Comanche. My people lived on these plains long before your people came from across the great water. But I am not like the Indians in your stories, because your stories are told by people who never knew us. Were you ever in battles?" Annabeth asked, apparently fascinated rather than frightened by the idea. "Many battles," Benjamin answered honestly. "But those days are finished. Now I raise horses and cattle, read books, and try to live in peace with all my neighbors." Annabeth considered this with the seriousness of a judge weighing evidence. "Mama says Papa is in heaven now, watching over us. Do you think he can see us here in your house?" Benjamin's throat tightened at the child's question, remembering his own conversations with the spirits of the dead, his own need to believe that love transcends the boundary between life and death. "I believe the spirits of good people never truly leave us. Your Papa's love for you and your Mama did not die with his body. It lives in your memories, in the lessons he taught you, in the courage your Mama showed when she walked for 2 days to find safety for you both." Margaret looked at Benjamin with surprise and something approaching wonder. "You speak of such things with great certainty. My people have always known that death is not an ending, but a transformation," Benjamin replied, rising to retrieve the bowls of stew from the stove. "We speak with our ancestors, ask for their guidance, feel their presence in the wind and the movement of animals. Perhaps your husband's spirit guided you to my door." As he served the food, Margaret noticed the quality of the meal tender. Beef, vegetables that spoke of a well-maintained garden, bread that was clearly homemade and fresh. This was not the rough fare of a bachelor struggling to survive, but the cooking of someone who took pride in hospitality and understood that food was one of the fundamental ways humans showed care for one another. Annabeth ate with the desperate hunger of someone who had been subsisting on whatever forage her mother could find along the trail. Between bites, she peppered Benjamin with questions that revealed both her natural curiosity and her need to understand this new world she found herself in. "Do you live here all by yourself?" she asked around a mouthful of stew. "I do," Benjamin answered. "It has been my choice, though sometimes I wonder if it was the right choice. Do you get lonely?" The question carried the weight of someone who understood loneliness intimately. Benjamin paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "Yes," he said simply, "very lonely." Margaret felt something shift in her chest at his honesty. In her world, Men, especially men with reputations for toughness, did not admit to vulnerability so readily. Have you never married? War does not leave much time for courting, Benjamin replied. And after the war, I found myself caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. White women feared me, and Comanche women could not understand why I chose to live apart from our people. He set down his spoon and looked directly at Margaret. What are your plans now? Where will you and Annabeth go? The question Margaret had been dreading finally arrived, bringing with it the full weight of her desperate situation. I do not know, she admitted. Thomas sold everything to fund this journey. We have no family left in Kansas, no money for passage back east. I suppose I hope to find work in one of the towns, maybe as a seamstress or taking in laundry. Benjamin's expression darkened. Mrs. Harper, I must tell you something about the towns in this region. A woman alone with a child, no husband for protection, no connections for vouching. You would find yourself in a very dangerous position very quickly. What do you mean? Margaret asked, though something in his tone suggested she might not want to know the answer. Men who prey on the desperate. Saloon owners who offer jobs that are not what they seem. People who would take advantage of your situation in ways that would destroy both you and Annabeth. Benjamin's voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much of humanity's darker impulses. The frontier is not kind to women without protection. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as the implications became clear. Then what choice do I have? Before Benjamin could answer, a sound from outside froze all three of them. The deliberate creak of a board on the front porch, the soft scrape of a boot, being placed carefully to avoid noise. Someone was approaching the cabin with obvious intent to remain undetected. Benjamin moved with liquid speed, rising from his chair and crossing to the window in one fluid motion. His hand went automatically to the gun at his hip as he peered through a gap in the curtains. What he saw made his jaw tighten with anger and recognition. Mrs. Harper, he said quietly, his voice carrying a deadly calm that raised the hair on Margaret's arms. I need you to take Annabeth into the back room. Lock the door and do not come out until I tell you it is safe. What is it? Margaret whispered, gathering her daughter into her arms. The men who have been following you, Benjamin replied, checking his weapon with practiced efficiency. They have found you. Outside, voices could be heard conferring in low tones, planning something that required stealth and coordination. Margaret felt her world tilt sideways as she realized that her journey to safety had instead led her into a trap that might destroy not only herself and Annabeth, but the kind man who had offered them shelter. Benjamin Iron Eagle had survived cavalry charges, fought in battles that entered legend, and carved out a peaceful existence from a hostile world. But as he prepared to face whatever threat waited outside his door, he knew that this confrontation would test not just his warrior skills, but his commitment to protecting the innocent family that had stumbled into his life. The war might have ended for most people, but for Benjamin Iron Eagle, the most important battle of his life was about to begin. Margaret Harper clutched Annabeth against her chest as they huddled in Benjamin's back room. The child's small body trembling with fear she was too young to fully understand. Through the thin wooden walls, they could hear boots scraping against the porch boards, followed by voices that carried the rough accents of men who lived outside the boundaries of civilized society. Garrett, you sure this is the right place? The voice belonged to someone trying to sound confident, but failing to hide his nervousness. Course I'm sure, you fool, came the reply, thick with the kind of authority that came from violence rather than leadership. Tracked him for 2 days straight. Woman and kid went up that path, and there ain't nowhere else they could have gone. Benjamin positioned himself beside the front window, his Colt drawn but held low and ready. His warrior's training had taught him to read men by their voices, their movements, their intentions, and what he heard outside his door spoke of predators who had found what they believed to be easy prey. The mistake they were making, assuming that Margaret and Annabeth were helpless, would be their last. "Jake says the woman's got money," a third voice added, younger and more eager than the others. "Her husband was carrying a pouch full of gold coins when he died. Has to be on her somewhere." Margaret's blood turned to ice as she realized the full scope of their danger. These men had not simply stumbled across their trail. They had been watching, waiting, following them since Thomas's death. In her grief and desperation to find shelter for Annabeth, she had led killers directly to the doorstep of the one person who had shown them kindness. Benjamin's jaw tightened as he processed what he was hearing. These were not random bandits, but organized predators who had targeted the Harper family specifically. The implications were clear and deadly. They knew about Thomas Harper's death. They knew about any money the family might have been carrying. And they had been patient enough to follow mother and child for days rather than attacking immediately. "Garrett Mullins," Benjamin called out through the closed door, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded violence. "I know who you are, and I know what you want. Take your men and ride away now while you still can." Silence fell over the porch, broken only by the soft whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees. Benjamin could practically hear the mental calculations taking place outside. 3 men against 1, surprise on their side, confidence born from successful raids against defenseless settlers. What they could not calculate was that they faced not just any man, but a Comanche warrior whose reputation had once struck fear into cavalry officers across 2 territories. "Well, I'll be damned," Garrett Mullins finally replied, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and predatory excitement. "Boys, we got ourselves a genuine Injun, Benjamin Iron Eagle, ain't it? Heard you was supposed to be some kind of war chief back in the day." "I was never a chief," Benjamin replied, moving silently to a different window to gain a better view of his opponents. "Chiefs were wise men who led through counsel and negotiation. I was simply a warrior who fought to protect my people." Harsh laughter erupted from the porch. "Protect your people? How'd that work out for you, Chief? Last I heard, all your people were penned up on reservations, eating government beef, and learning to pray to the white man's God." Benjamin felt the familiar burn of rage that had once driven him to paint his face for war, but he pushed it down with the discipline of years. Anger was a luxury he could not afford with Margaret and Annabeth depending on him for protection. Instead, he used the conversation to gather intelligence about his opponents. Through careful observation, he counted 3 distinct voices and could see the shadows of at least that many figures moving around his porch. Garrett Mullins appeared to be the leader, a man Benjamin remembered hearing about in Adobe Wells, a former Confederate deserter who had turned to robbing settlers and small ranches with a gang of similarly desperate men. The other 2 voices suggested younger men, probably followers rather than leaders, which meant they would be easier to intimidate if their leader fell. "What do you want, Mullins?" Benjamin asked, though he already knew the answer. "Same thing we wanted when we started following that pretty widow and her little girl," Mullins replied with the casual cruelty of a man who had abandoned any pretense of humanity. "Her husband was carrying a fair amount of gold when that snake bit him. Figure it belongs to us now, seeing as how they ain't got no more use for it. And if I refuse to hand them over, then we take 'em anyway, and you get to join that husband of hers in whatever hole she stuck him in." Mullins's voice hardened with the promise of violence. "Your choice, Injun. 3 against 1 ain't good odds, even for a famous warrior." Benjamin smiled grimly as he recognized the tactical error his opponents were making. They assumed that his reputation was inflated legend, that years of peaceful ranching had softened him, that facing 3 armed men would overwhelm him with fear. The truth was exactly the opposite. Combat was where Benjamin Iron Eagle had always been most comfortable, most alive, most himself. "Mullins," Benjamin called out, his voice carrying a new note that made the hair on the outlaw's neck stand up. "You have made 2 mistakes tonight. First, you assumed that I would hand over guests who have claimed the protection of my house. Second, you assumed that 3 cowards who prey on widows and children could face a Comanche warrior and live to boast about it. The temperature on the porch seemed to drop several degrees as Benjamin's words registered. In the back room, Margaret heard the change in her protector's voice and felt a chill run down her spine. She was beginning to understand that the gentle, scholarly man who had fed them stew and answered Annabeth's questions was only one side of Benjamin Iron Eagle's nature. Big talk from a man hiding behind a door, one of the younger outlaws called out, his voice cracking with nervous bravado. "Why don't you come on out here and let's settle this like men?" Benjamin's response was to extinguish the oil lamps in the main room, plunging the cabin into darkness that negated his opponent's advantage in numbers. Years of living between 2 worlds had taught him to use every available resource, and darkness was a warrior's friend. "Jake, go around back," Mullins ordered, his confidence beginning to waver as the situation moved beyond his control. "Billy, you take the east side. I'll keep him talking from the front." Through the walls, Margaret could hear boots moving around the cabin, surrounding them like wolves circling wounded prey. Annabeth whimpered softly, and Margaret pressed her hand gently over her daughter's mouth, not to silence her, but to muffle any sound that might give away their exact location. Benjamin had anticipated this tactic and was already moving through his own house with the silent efficiency of a predator in familiar territory. He knew every board that creaked, every piece of furniture that could provide cover, every angle that offered tactical advantage. More importantly, he knew something his opponents did not. The cabin had been built with defense in mind, incorporating lessons learned from years of warfare. The first shot came from the back of the house as Jake attempted to force his way through the rear door. The heavy wooden barrier, reinforced with iron strapping, absorbed the bullet with barely a tremor. Jake's curse of frustration was followed immediately by a sound that made Margaret's blood freeze, the distinctive whistle of an arrow in flight. Jake's scream cut off abruptly, replaced by the heavy thud of a body hitting the ground. Benjamin had not abandoned all of his traditional weapons when he adopted the white man's way of life, and a Comanche war bow was silent, deadly, and accurate in the hands of someone who had learned to use it from childhood. "Jake!" Mullins shouted from the front porch. "Jake, answer me!" Silence was the only reply, and Benjamin could hear the surviving outlaw's breathing becoming more rapid, more panicked. They had expected to face a civilized rancher, not a warrior who could kill silently in the darkness. "Billy, what do you see over there?" Mullins called to his remaining accomplice. Billy's response was a terrified shout. "Garrett, there's a damn arrow sticking out of Jake's chest. This ain't no ordinary settler we're dealing with." Benjamin used their moment of confusion to reposition himself near the front door, his Colt ready, but his grandfather's war club within easy reach. The club was a weapon from another era, its stone head wrapped in leather and decorated with eagle feathers, but in close combat it could crush a man's skull with a single blow. "Mullins," Benjamin called out, his voice now carrying the war cry cadence that had once terrified enemies across the plains. "Your man Jake learned tonight that death comes swiftly to those who threaten the innocent. You and Billy can join him, or you can ride away and live to rob someone else another day." "You murdered Jake!" Billy screamed from somewhere near the east wall of the cabin. "Shot him down like a dog." "I executed a man who came to harm a woman and child under my protection," Benjamin corrected. "There is a difference, though. I do not expect cowards like you to understand it." Margaret pressed her ear to the wall, trying to follow the deadly conversation taking place outside. She could hear the fear creeping into Billy's voice, the way his breathing had become ragged with panic. Whatever Benjamin had done to Jake had shattered the outlaws' confidence in their superiority. "This ain't over, Iron Eagle," Mullins shouted, but his voice was moving away from the cabin now, retreating toward where they had left their horses. "You can't watch over them forever. We'll be back when you least expect it." Then you will die when you least expect it. Benjamin replied with the certainty of a man who had never made a threat he was not prepared to carry out. And this time, I will not be so merciful as to kill you quickly. The sound of galloping. Horses faded into the distance, but Benjamin did not immediately move from his defensive position. Years of warfare had taught him that retreats could be feints, that desperate men sometimes doubled back for surprise attacks. He waited in the darkness, listening to the night sounds, feeling for any disturbance in the natural rhythm of his ranch. Only when he was completely satisfied that the threat had passed did he rekindle the lamps and call out to Margaret and Annabeth. "It is safe now, you can come out." The back room door opened slowly, and Margaret emerged first, her face pale but determined. Annabeth clung to her mother's skirts, her wide eyes taking in the darkened cabin and the grim expression on Benjamin's face. "Are they gone?" Margaret whispered. "For now," Benjamin replied, moving to the window to scan the darkness one more time. "But they will return, probably with more men." Garrett Millins is not the type to accept defeat gracefully. Margaret felt her knees go weak as the full implications hit her. "We have brought danger to your home. This is our fault. We should leave, find somewhere else." "You will do no such thing," Benjamin interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You are under my protection now, and I do not abandon those who have claimed sanctuary in my house." Annabeth looked up at Benjamin with something approaching awe. "Did you really kill that bad man with a bow and arrow?" Benjamin knelt down to her level, his expression softening as he spoke to the child. "I protected you and your mama the only way I could. Sometimes good people have to do difficult things to keep bad people from hurting others. Like Papa would have done. If he was still here?" "Exactly like your Papa would have done," Benjamin confirmed, reaching out to gently touch the child's cheek. "He would have fought to protect you with everything he had." Margaret watched this interaction with growing understanding. Benjamin Iron Eagle was not just a man caught between two worlds, he was a protector by nature, someone who had found his purpose in defending those who could not defend themselves. The gentle scholar who had fed them stew was the same man who had just killed to keep them safe. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Benjamin rose to his full height, his expression hardening as he considered their options. "Now we prepare for war. Mullins will be back, probably within a few days, and he will bring more men. We need to be ready for them." "We?" Margaret asked, surprised by his use of the plural. "You are family now," Benjamin replied simply. "In Comanche tradition, once you have shared food in my house and I have shed blood to protect you, you are as close to me as if we shared the same grandparents. That bond is not broken by convenience or danger." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes at his words. "We are strangers to you. You owe us nothing." "You are wrong about both things," Benjamin said, moving to secure the cabin for the night. "You are no longer strangers, and I owe you more than you know. You have given me something I lost years ago, a reason to be a warrior again." As Benjamin checked the locks and barricaded the doors, Margaret realized that their arrival at his ranch had changed everything for all of them. They were no longer simply a desperate widow and orphaned child seeking shelter. They had become part of something larger, something that would be tested by fire and proven by blood. The war for their survival was just beginning, but for the first time since Thomas's death, Margaret felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. Dawn broke over Benjamin Iron Eagle's ranch with the deceptive peace of a world that looked unchanged, but had been forever altered by the violence of the previous night. Margaret Harper stood at the kitchen window, watching as Benjamin moved through his morning routine with the methodical precision of a man who understood that preparation could mean the difference between life and death. His movements carried none of yesterday's scholarly gentleness. Every gesture now spoke of a warrior preparing for battle. Annabeth sat at the kitchen table, her small hands wrapped around a cup of milk that Benjamin had drawn fresh from his Jersey cow before sunrise. The child watched their host with the fascination of someone witnessing a complete transformation, as if the kind man who had answered her questions about books and horses had been replaced overnight by someone from the adventure stories her father used to read to her. "Why is he digging holes in the yard?" Annabeth asked, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact curiosity that only children possess when confronted with adult behavior they do not understand. Margaret followed her daughter's gaze to where Benjamin was systematically excavating what appeared to be strategic positions around the cabin, his powerful shoulders working steadily as he carved fighting positions from the hard-packed earth. "He is preparing to protect us," she replied, though the full implications of those preparations made her stomach clench with fear. Benjamin had risen before dawn to begin fortifying his ranch against the return of Garrett Mullins and his gang. The peaceful homestead was being transformed into a fortress, with defensive positions that revealed a sophisticated understanding of military tactics that went far beyond the guerrilla warfare for which the Comanche were famous. This was the work of a man who had studied his enemies' methods and learned to turn their own strategies against them. The first priority had been water, ensuring that a siege could not force them out through thirst. Benjamin had spent an hour clearing and widening the channel that brought creek water to his stock tanks, creating a reliable supply that could not be easily cut off. He had also filled every available container in the cabin with fresh water, knowing that a single well-placed shot could sever their connection to the creek. The second priority was sightlines, removing brush and obstacles that could provide cover for attackers while preserving defensive positions that would allow him to control approaches to the cabin. Benjamin worked with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, someone who understood that every detail could be crucial. When violence erupted, he trimmed branches that might conceal a sniper, cleared fields of fire from his defensive positions, and created obstacles that would channel attackers into predetermined killing zones. As Margaret watched him work, she began to understand the full scope of what Benjamin Iron Eagle had been before he became a peaceful rancher. His movements around the defensive positions showed the fluidity of someone who had fought from cover many times before, who understood instinctively how to use terrain to his advantage. This was not a man playing at being a soldier. This was a warrior preparing to defend his territory. The transformation extended beyond mere physical preparations. Benjamin's entire demeanor had shifted overnight from the gentle scholar who had fed them stew to something far more dangerous. He moved with the predatory grace of someone who had spent years hunting and being hunted, his eyes constantly scanning for threats, his hands never far from his weapons. Margaret found herself both reassured and frightened by this change. Reassured because she knew he was capable of protecting them, frightened because she was beginning to understand the true cost of survival on the frontier. "Mrs. Harper," Benjamin called from across the yard, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. "I need to teach you and Annabeth some things that may keep you alive in the coming days." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat at his words. What kind of things? How to load and fire a rifle. How to recognize the difference between my signals and sounds made by enemies. Where to go if the cabin is breached, and how to get there without being seen. Benjamin's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing crop rotation or weather patterns, rather than life and death skills. Annabeth set down her milk cup with the deliberate care of someone trying to appear older than her years. "Are you going to teach me to shoot too?" Benjamin paused in his digging, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. In Comanche culture, children learned survival skills as soon as they were old enough to hold a weapon, because the frontier made no distinction between adult enemies and young ones when violence erupted. "I am going to teach you to stay alive," he replied finally. "Sometimes that means knowing how to shoot. Sometimes it means knowing when to run and hide." Margaret felt a surge of maternal protectiveness at the idea of her 8-year-old daughter handling firearms, but the memory of the previous night's terror forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth. The normal rules of childhood safety no longer applied to their situation. Annabeth's survival might depend on skills that no child should need to learn. "Show us," Margaret said quietly, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Benjamin retrieved a rifle from inside the cabin, not the modern repeating rifle he carried for his own defense, but an older single-shot weapon that would be easier for inexperienced hands to manage. The rifle was a Springfield Model 1861, a veteran of the Civil War that had found its way to the Texas frontier like so many other remnants of that conflict. Its long barrel and substantial weight made it intimidating to handle, but its single shot mechanism was simple enough for a novice to master. He demonstrated the loading process with the patience of someone who had taught these skills before, probably to young Comanche warriors who needed to master them quickly. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he showed them how to measure powder, ran the bullet home, and capped the nipple with percussion caps that would ignite the charge. "The most important thing to remember," he explained as Margaret fumbled, "with the unfamiliar mechanisms, is that a gun is only useful if you are willing to use it. If you point a weapon at someone, you must be prepared to kill them. Hesitation will get you killed, and more importantly, it will get Annabeth killed." Margaret's hands trembled as she tried to work the rifle's action, the weight of the weapon feeling alien and dangerous in her grip. The metal was cold against her palms, and she could smell the lingering scent of gun oil and powder residue that spoke of recent use. "I do not know if I can actually shoot another human being." "Then you will die," Benjamin replied with brutal honesty, "and your daughter will suffer a fate worse than death." Garrett Melans and men like him do not show mercy to those who cannot defend themselves. They see gentleness as weakness to be exploited. The harsh truth of his words settled over Margaret like a cold blanket. In her protected life as a farmer's wife, violence had been something that happened to other people, in other places, far from the safe boundaries of civilized society. She had read about Indian raids and outlaw gangs in newspapers, but those stories had seemed as remote as fairy tales. But Thomas's death had stripped away that illusion, and the arrival of the outlaws had shattered it completely. Annabeth surprised them both by reaching for the rifle with steady hands. "Let me try," she said, her young voice carrying a determination that reminded Margaret painfully of her father's stubborn courage. Benjamin knelt beside the child, guiding her small hands to the proper positions on the weapon while being careful to keep it pointed in a safe direction. The rifle was nearly as tall as Annabeth herself, its polished walnut stock gleaming in the morning sunlight. "This is heavier than you are used to," he observed. "You will need to brace it against something solid when you shoot, or the recoil will knock you down." "Have you taught children to shoot before?" Annabeth asked, struggling slightly with the rifle's weight, but maintaining her grip with admirable persistence. "Many children," Benjamin replied, his voice carrying undertones of memories, both proud and painful. "In my people's way of life, children learned to hunt and fight as soon as they were strong enough to draw a bowstring. The world was dangerous, and only those who could defend themselves lived to become adults." Margaret watched this interaction with growing unease, not because she doubted Benjamin's intentions, but because she could see her daughter changing before her eyes. The innocent child who had picked wildflowers for her father's grave was being forced to become something harder, more dangerous, more prepared for a world that showed no mercy to the weak. It was a necessary transformation, but that did not make it any less heartbreaking. Benjamin spent the next hour drilling them both on the basics of firearms handling. He showed them how to clean the rifle, how to store ammunition properly, how to recognize when a weapon had misfired and might be dangerous to operate. His instruction was thorough and patient, but Margaret could see the urgency beneath his calm exterior. They were racing against time, trying to compress years of training into a few hours. "What about hiding places?" Margaret asked, trying to focus on practical matters rather than the philosophical implications of teaching her daughter to kill. Benjamin led them to a section of the cabin where he had constructed what appeared to be a normal storage area, but was actually a concealed bunker. The entrance was hidden behind a movable panel that looked like part of the wall, crafted with such skill that even close examination would not reveal its true nature. The space inside was larger than Margaret had expected, carved into the earth. Beneath the cabin's foundation, with enough room for both her and Annabeth to remain hidden for extended periods. If fighting breaks out and I signal you to hide, you come here immediately, Benjamin instructed, showing them how to operate the concealed latch that secured the entrance. There's water, food, blankets, and even a chamber pot. You can stay hidden for days if necessary. The hiding place was stocked with supplies that spoke of careful planning: jerked beef, hardtack, dried fruit, and water stored in sealed containers that would remain fresh for weeks. There were also blankets, a small oil lamp with extra fuel, and even a few books that Annabeth might use to pass the time if they were forced to remain hidden for extended periods. Annabeth crawled into the hiding space, testing its dimensions, with the thoroughness of someone who understood that her life might depend on this knowledge. The ceiling was low enough that an adult would have to crouch, but a child could move around comfortably. "What if something happens to you?" she asked, her voice muffled by the confined space. "What if the bad men hurt you and we have to stay hidden forever?" Benjamin's expression softened as he contemplated the child's practical question. "If I am killed or badly wounded, you wait until full darkness. Then you leave through the back panel that opens onto the creek bank. Follow the water downstream until you reach the main road, then walk toward adobe wells. Tell anyone you meet that you are under the protection of Chief Running Bear. He will know what that means." He showed them the rear exit of the hiding place, a carefully concealed opening that led to a tunnel extending 50 feet from the cabin, before emerging in a thicket of willows near the creek. The tunnel was another marvel of engineering, properly shored with timber and ventilated through hidden shafts that prevented the air from becoming stale. Margaret felt a chill at his matter-of-fact discussion of his own potential death. "Who is Chief Running Bear?" "My cousin," Benjamin replied. "He leads the band of our people who remained close to the reservation, but maintained their independence. He would honor the kinship bond and see that you and Annabeth were protected." The morning progressed with Benjamin continuing to transform his peaceful ranch into a military stronghold. He moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, someone who understood that every detail could be crucial when violence erupted. Margaret found herself drafted into the preparations, helping to move supplies, learning the locations of ammunition caches, memorizing the signals that would tell her when to fight and when to hide. Benjamin had prepared multiple defensive positions around the ranch, each one carefully sited to provide overlapping fields of fire while offering protection from return shots. He showed Margaret and Annabeth each position, explaining its purpose and the circumstances under which it might be used. The main fighting position was located in the cabin's second floor, where a small window provided an excellent view of the approaches, while thick log walls offered substantial protection. "From here, a single rifleman can control the entire yard," Benjamin explained, demonstrating how the window had been modified to provide a stable shooting rest. "The angles are such that attackers cannot approach the cabin without exposing themselves to fire from this position." Secondary positions included a dugout behind the barn, a rifle pit near the corral, and a carefully concealed spider hole that allowed movement between defensive positions without being seen by attackers. Each position was stocked with ammunition, water, and basic medical supplies, ensuring that the defense could continue even if some positions were overrun. By midday, the ranch looked like a different place entirely. What had been a welcoming homestead now bristled with defensive preparations that spoke of serious military planning. Firing positions commanded every approach. Supplies were distributed to prevent a single lucky shot from cutting off access to necessities. And escape routes were prepared for every possible scenario. "You have done this before," Margaret observed as Benjamin checked his rifle for the dozenth time that morning. Many times, he confirmed. The difference is that in the old days, I was usually the one attacking fortified positions rather than defending them. It is interesting to see warfare from the other perspective. Annabeth looked up from where she was practicing loading and unloading the rifle under Benjamin's supervision. Her small hands had grown steadier with repetition, and she could now manage the complex sequence of operations required to prepare the weapon for firing. Were you a famous warrior? Like in the stories about Indian fighters? Benjamin considered how to answer honestly without frightening the child unnecessarily. I was known to my enemies, he said finally. Cavalry officers carried descriptions of me, and there was a reward offered for my capture. But fame and effectiveness are not the same thing. The most dangerous warriors are often the ones whose names are never spoken. What made you stop fighting? Annabeth's questions had the directness that adults often found uncomfortable, but that Benjamin seemed to appreciate. I realized that no matter how many battles we won, we were losing the war, he replied. My people were dying, not just from bullets but from disease, starvation, and despair. Continuing to fight would have meant watching them disappear entirely. Sometimes the most courageous thing a warrior can do is lay down his weapons and find a new way to protect his people. Margaret felt something shift in her understanding of the man who had taken them in. Benjamin Iron Eagle had not abandoned his warrior nature when he became a rancher. He had redirected it toward a different kind of battle, one fought with persistence and adaptation rather than raids and warfare. The transition from war to peace had not been a retreat, but a strategic repositioning, a recognition that survival sometimes required different tactics. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, a young Comanche man who rode up to the ranch. Openly, his hands visible and his intentions clearly peaceful. He was perhaps 25 years old, with the lean build of someone who spent most of his time on horseback, and he carried himself with the confident bearing of a seasoned warrior. His clothing was a mixture of traditional Comanche garments and practical frontier wear, marking him as someone who moved easily between two worlds. Benjamin greeted him in their native language, a rapid exchange that Margaret could not follow but that seemed to convey important information. The conversation was punctuated by gestures toward the horizon and frequent glances at the defensive preparations Benjamin had been making. Whatever news the young man brought, it was clearly significant. Who was that? Margaret asked after the visitor had departed. A scout from Running Bear's band, Benjamin replied, his expression troubled. Mullins has been to Adobe Wells recruiting more men. He is offering significant money for anyone willing to help him capture you and Annabeth alive. Margaret's blood turned to ice at the implications. The fact that Mullins wanted them alive suggested purposes that she did not want to contemplate. How many men? At least a dozen, possibly more. And not just drifters and petty criminals. He has attracted the attention of some genuinely dangerous individuals who see an opportunity for easy profit. Benjamin's voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what kind of men would be drawn to such an opportunity. Annabeth looked up from cleaning the rifle she had been practicing with, her young face showing a composure that would have been admirable in an adult. When will they come? Tonight, most likely, Benjamin replied. Mullins is not patient enough to wait longer, and he knows that every day gives us more time to prepare or to call for help. Margaret realized that their brief respite was ending, that the real test of Benjamin's preparations and her own courage was about to begin. What do we do? Benjamin checked his weapons one final time, his movements carrying the ritualistic precision of a warrior preparing for what might be his final battle. His hands moved over each weapon with the familiarity of long association, the modern repeating rifle that would be his primary weapon, the traditional war bow that had served him in countless battles, the knife his grandfather had given him, and the Colt revolver that represented his adaptation to the white man's way of warfare. We defend our home, he said simply, we protect our family. And we show Garrett Mullins that some things are worth dying for. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the fortified ranch, Margaret Harper realized that she was no longer simply a widow seeking shelter for her child. She had become part of something larger, a family forged by circumstance and tested by violence, bound together by the ancient code that said the strong must protect the weak. No matter the cost, the approaching darkness would bring more than night to the Texas plains. It would bring a reckoning that would test everything they had learned, everything they had prepared for, and everything they were willing to sacrifice to preserve the fragile sanctuary they had built together. The Texas night descended like a black curtain over Benjamin Iron Eagle's ranch, bringing with it the kind of silence that preceded violence. Margaret Harper sat in the darkened cabin, her hands gripping the Springfield rifle that had become as familiar as a prayer book in the past few hours, while Annabeth lay curled beside her on the floor, feigning sleep with the discipline Benjamin had taught her. Outside, the world held its breath, waiting for the storm that everyone knew was coming. Benjamin moved through his defensive positions with the ghostly silence of a man who had spent years learning to be invisible when necessity demanded it. His moccasined feet made no sound on the packed earth as he checked each rifle pit, each ammunition cache, each carefully prepared killing zone that would soon be tested by men who had mistaken his hospitality for weakness. The warrior paint he had applied to his face, red and black stripes that honored his ancestors and announced his deadly intentions, seemed to absorb the starlight, making him appear more shadow than substance. At 11:47, the horses in the corral began to shift nervously, their ears pricked toward sounds that human senses could not yet detect. Benjamin had positioned himself in the main defensive position on the cabin's second floor, where a modified window provided an excellent field of fire, while thick log walls offered substantial protection. Through his field glasses, a trophy taken from a cavalry officer years earlier, he could see movement in the tree line beyond his cleared killing zones. Garrett Mullins had brought an army. Benjamin counted at least 15 men, possibly more, moving through the darkness with the kind of coordination that suggested military experience. These were not the desperate drifters and petty criminals who usually followed outlaw leaders, but hardened fighters who understood tactics and discipline. Someone had been recruiting from the ranks of Confederate deserters and displaced soldiers who had found no place in the post-war world except at the end of a gun barrel. The attack began not with gunfire, but with fire itself, flaming arrows that arced through the darkness like falling stars, aimed at the cabin's roof and the hay stored in the barn. Benjamin had anticipated this tactic and prepared accordingly, soaking the wooden shingles with water and clearing combustible materials from around the buildings. But the psychological effect was immediate and terrifying. Annabeth whimpered softly at the sight of flames dancing across the night sky. "Stay calm, little warrior," Benjamin called down from his position, his voice carrying the steady confidence that had once inspired Comanche braves to follow him into impossible battles. "They are trying to frighten us, but fire is just another weapon, and like all weapons, it can be defeated by courage and preparation." Margaret watched through a gun port as dark figures moved closer to the cabin, using the scattered buildings and defensive obstacles as cover. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird, but her hands remained steady on the rifle. Benjamin's training had been thorough. She knew exactly what to do when the moment came, even if every instinct screamed at her to hide rather than fight. The first shot came from the tree line, a muzzle flash that illuminated a bearded face. For an instant before the bullet splintered wood near Benjamin's position. His return shot was immediate and devastating. A Call 44-40 Winchester round that found its target with the precision of a man who had never wasted ammunition when his life depended on accuracy. The scream that followed told everyone within hearing that Benjamin Iron Eagle had not lost his warrior skills during his years of peaceful ranching. "Jesus Christ, boys," Mullins shouted from somewhere in the darkness. "That red devil can. Shoot. Spread out and keep moving. Don't give him stationary targets." But Benjamin had fought cavalry troopers who were better trained and better equipped than Mullins' gang, and he had learned to use every advantage that terrain and preparation could provide. As the outlaws spread out to flank his position, they moved directly into the killing zones he had prepared, exposing themselves to crossfire from multiple defensive positions that had been carefully sighted to overlap and support each other. The battle developed into a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Benjamin moving between his prepared positions like a phantom, while his enemies tried to coordinate their attacks in darkness, broken only by muzzle flashes and the occasional flame arrow. Every shot Benjamin fired seemed to find its mark, while the return fire from the outlaws went wild, aimed at shadows and imagination rather than the real targets. Margaret found herself thrust into the fight sooner than expected when two outlaws tried to break into the cabin through the kitchen window. The sound of breaking glass was followed immediately by voices discussing how to divide the spoils they expected to find inside. Margaret's finger tightened on the trigger of her Springfield, and she discovered that when her daughter's life was threatened, she had no hesitation about killing the men who endangered it. The rifle's recoil knocked her backward, but her shot had been true. The outlaw who had been climbing through the window crumpled with a bullet through his chest, his blood staining the kitchen floor as his partner scrambled for cover. Margaret worked the rifle's mechanism with shaking hands, reloading with the mechanical precision Benjamin had drilled into her, preparing for the second shot that might determine whether she and Annabeth lived or died. "Mama, behind you!" Annabeth's sharp cry warned Margaret of a third attacker who had circled around to the cabin's rear entrance. The child had been watching through a gun port with the alertness of a seasoned sentry, and her warning gave Margaret just enough time to turn and fire before the outlaw could bring his own weapon to bear. The second shot was easier than the first, perhaps because Margaret had already crossed the line between civilization and survival, or perhaps because the man she was shooting had just tried to murder her 8-year-old daughter. The bullet caught the outlaw in the throat, and he went down gurgling blood and clutching at a wound that would never heal. Outside, Benjamin had accounted for at least 4 more of Mullins' men, using a combination of rifle fire from his elevated position and the traditional war bow that allowed him to kill silently when stealth was more valuable than firepower. The outlaws were discovering that attacking a fortified position, defended by a man who had spent years perfecting the art of warfare, was far different from robbing helpless settlers or intimidating townspeople, but numbers eventually began to tell. Despite their losses, the outlaws had enough men to press attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing Benjamin to divide his attention and making it impossible for him to maintain the concentrated firepower that had been devastating their initial assaults. Worse, they had started using tactics that showed genuine military thinking, suppressing fire to pin him down while assault teams moved closer under cover. "Iron Eagle!" Mullins shouted from the darkness, his voice carrying the desperation of a man who had committed too much to retreat without victory. "You killed good men tonight, but we got you surrounded now, and we ain't going nowhere. Send out the woman and kid, and maybe we'll let you live to see morning." Benjamin's response was another perfectly placed shot that silenced whatever outlaw had been incautious enough to expose himself while Mullins was talking. But he could feel the tactical situation deteriorating. His ammunition was running low. The outlaws were getting closer despite his best efforts, and he could smell smoke that suggested they had succeeded in setting fire to something, despite his precautions inside the cabin. Margaret reloaded her rifle for what she feared might be the last time, her hands now steady with the calmness that sometimes comes to people when they have accepted that death is inevitable but are determined to make it costly for their enemies. Annabeth crouched beside her, clutching a loaded pistol that looked enormous in her small hands, but which she held with the competence of someone who had learned that survival sometimes depended on skills no child should need. "Mama, Anna." Beth whispered, "If the bad men get inside, I want you to know that Papa would be proud of how brave you've been." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes at her daughter's words, but she forced herself to focus on the rifle sights and the shadows moving beyond the broken windows. "Papa would be proud of both of us, sweetheart, and so would Uncle Benjamin." The final assault came just after midnight, when the outlaws rushed the cabin from 3 directions simultaneously in a coordinated attack that showed they had finally learned to work together effectively. Benjamin met them with rifle fire that dropped 2 men immediately, but the others kept coming, driven by greed and fury and the knowledge that retreat now meant they had lost everything. Margaret found herself firing as fast as she could reload, her shots wild but frequent enough to discourage the outlaws who were trying to break through the kitchen entrance. Beside her, Annabeth aimed her pistol with the careful deliberation Benjamin had taught her, waiting for targets close enough that even a child could not miss, but there were too many attackers and too few defenders. Despite their preparations, despite Benjamin's skill and Margaret's desperate courage, the outlaws were breaking through the defensive perimeter. Margaret could hear boots on the cabin's roof, voices shouting coordination signals, the sound of axes biting into the cabin's walls as the attackers tried to create new entrances. That was when the sound of war cries echoed across the night, not the shouts of white men, but the distinctive battle calls of Comanche warriors riding to combat. Chief Running Bear and a dozen of his best fighters swept out of the darkness like avenging spirits, their ponies' hooves drumming against the earth in the rhythm that had once struck terror into the hearts of their enemies. The outlaws caught between Benjamin's defensive fire and the sudden appearance of Comanche warriors attacking from their rear, broke and ran like the cowards they had always been beneath their bluster. Some tried to surrender, crying out that they yielded, but Comanche justice was not interested in mercy for men who made war on women and children. Garrett Mullins himself tried to reach his horse, running through the darkness with the desperate speed of a man who knew that capture meant a death far worse than anything a bullet could provide. But Benjamin Iron Eagle had not forgotten the skills that had made him one of the most feared warriors on the southern plains, and his war arrow found Mullins between the shoulder blades, just as the outlaw reached his mount. The battle that had seemed destined to end in tragedy for the defenders transformed into a rout that left the surviving outlaws scattered across the Texas night. Those few who lived carrying word that Benjamin Iron Eagle was still a man to be feared. But the victory had come at a cost. The cabin was damaged. The barn was burned. And Margaret realized as she surveyed the carnage that she had crossed a line from which there could be no return. "You fought well," Benjamin said as he helped her to her feet, his painted face making him look like a figure from legend in the flickering light of the burning barn. "Both of you fought like warriors." Annabeth stood beside them, still clutching her pistol, her young face streaked with gunpowder and tears, but showing a composure that spoke of strength inherited from both her parents. "Are we safe now, Uncle Benjamin?" "You are safe," he confirmed, gathering both Margaret and Annabeth into an embrace that felt like sanctuary after the terror of the past hours. "You are family now, and family protects family. That is the Comanche way, and it will always be our way." Chief Running Bear approached through the smoke and shadows, his weathered face showing satisfaction at a job well done. He spoke to Benjamin in their native language, a rapid exchange that Margaret could not follow but whose meaning was clear from the gestures and expressions of both men. "My cousin says that word of tonight's battle will spread quickly," Benjamin translated. "No one will trouble you again, because they will know that to attack you is to attack the entire band. You have more than shelter now, you have the protection of a people who never forget their debts or abandon their obligations." Margaret looked around at the devastation that surrounded them, dead outlaws scattered across the yard, buildings damaged by fire and gunshots, the peaceful ranch transformed into a battlefield. But she also saw something else. Annabeth standing straight and proud despite her tears, Benjamin bloody but unbowed, and warriors who had ridden through the night to protect strangers who had become family. The night that had begun with terror had ended with something far more precious than mere survival. It had ended with the forging of bonds that would last a lifetime, tested in blood and proven in fire. Margaret Harper was no longer a desperate widow seeking shelter. She had become a warrior in her own right, a protector of the innocent, a member of a family that measured loyalty not in blood, but in willingness to die for each other. As dawn broke over the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded Benjamin of his war paint, the three survivors stood together in the ruins of their battle, knowing that they had found something worth fighting for and would never have to fight alone again. 3 months after the night that forever changed their lives, Margaret Harper stood in the doorway of the rebuilt cabin, watching as Annabeth rode her pinto pony across the pasture with the confidence of someone born to the saddle. The child's laughter echoed across the Texas plains, a sound that had become as regular as sunrise since the morning they had awakened to find themselves not just survivors, but members of a family forged by blood in battle. The ranch bore little resemblance to the peaceful homestead that had first offered them sanctuary. Where once Benjamin Iron Eagle had lived in quiet solitude, reading by lamplight and tending his small herd in contemplative silence, now the property bustled with the activity of a thriving community. Chief Running Bear's band had established a semi-permanent camp in the valley below the main house, their tippas dotting the landscape like white flowers against the green grass of early spring. Benjamin himself had undergone a transformation, as complete as the one that had changed Margaret from desperate widow to confident frontierswoman. The scholarly rancher who had quoted Shakespeare and discussed philosophy was still present, but he was now balanced by the war chief who had emerged during their hour of greatest need. He moved between both worlds with an ease that spoke of a man who had finally found his true purpose. Uncle Benjamin, Annabeth called as she dismounted near the corral, using the title that had become as natural as breathing. Spotted Hawk says he'll teach me to use a bow if you give permission. Can I learn, please? Benjamin looked up from the fence he was repairing, his weathered hands pausing in their work as he considered the request. In the months since the battle, Annabeth had grown from a frightened child into a young person who moved between the white and Comanche worlds with the adaptability that only the very young possessed. She spoke enough Comanche to converse with the warriors, knew the names of every plant used for medicine or food, and could track animals across terrain that would challenge experienced hunters. Your mother must decide, Benjamin replied, though his slight smile suggested he already knew what Margaret's answer would be. But I think Spotted Hawk would be a good teacher. He has the patience needed to work with stubborn students. Annabeth grinned at the gentle insult, her blue eyes sparkling with the mischief that had returned as her confidence grew. Mama already said yes, but she told me to ask you too because you're my papa now. The casual way Annabeth spoke. The words hit Benjamin like a physical blow, not because they were unwelcome, but because they represented something he had never dared to hope for. In all his years of warfare and wandering, through all the battles won and lost, he had never imagined that fate would bring him a ready-made family who would choose to claim him as completely as he had claimed them. Margaret appeared in the doorway behind him, wiping flour from her hands with a dish towel, her face showing the kind of contentment that had seemed impossible during those desperate days when survival consumed every thought. Annabeth Harper, she said in mock sternness, what have I told you about putting people on the spot with your announcements? That it's not polite, Annabeth replied without a trace of repentance. But it's true, isn't it? Benjamin is my papa now, just like you're his wife now, even if you haven't had the ceremony yet. The child's matter-of-fact assessment of their situation brought color to Margaret's cheeks, but she did not contradict the statement. In the months following the battle, she and Benjamin had grown closer through shared responsibility and mutual respect, their relationship deepening from grateful dependence to something approaching genuine love. They had not spoken formally of marriage, but everyone on the ranch treated them as husband and wife, and neither had corrected the assumption. Marriage ceremonies are for people who need witnesses to make their promises binding, Benjamin said quietly, his dark eyes meeting Margaret's across the yard. Some promises are made in the heart and sealed by actions rather than words. Margaret felt her breath catch at his words, recognizing them as the closest thing to a formal proposal she was likely to receive from a man who had learned to express love through protection rather than poetry. Some promises, she agreed, softly, are kept every day rather than spoken once. Annabeth looked back and forth between the two adults, her 8-year-old mind processing the undercurrents of their conversation with surprising sophistication. Does that mean we're going to stay here forever? This is our home now. Benjamin knelt beside the child, bringing himself to her eye level with the same respect he had shown her from their first meeting. Annabeth, this will be your home for as long as you want it to be. But you should know that choosing to stay here means choosing to live between two worlds, the world your father came from and the world I come from. That can be difficult sometimes. I like both worlds, Annabeth replied with the certainty that only children possess. In Papa Thomas's world, people read books and plant gardens and build towns. In your world, people ride free across the plains and know how to talk to animals and find their way by the stars. Why should I have to choose just one? Margaret smiled at her daughter's wisdom, recognizing in it the same adaptability that had allowed their small family to thrive in circumstances that should have destroyed them. You don't have to choose, sweetheart. You can be everything you want to be. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar figure, Chief Running Bear, riding up to the cabin with the easy grace of someone who had spent more years on horseback than on foot. Behind him rode a young woman Margaret had not seen before, someone whose bearing and dress suggested she was from outside the immediate band. Benjamin and Running Bear spoke in rapid Comanche, their conversation punctuated by gestures toward the horizon and occasional glances at Margaret and Annabeth. Whatever news the chief brought, it was significant enough to require immediate discussion. What is it? Margaret asked when the conversation concluded. News from the territorial government, Benjamin replied, his expression troubled. There are new policies being discussed, laws that would affect how native people can own land, who they can live with, what rights they have to form communities like ours. Margaret felt a chill of fear at his words. In the months since the battle, she had begun to take their security for granted, assuming that their proven ability to defend themselves would be enough to guarantee their right to live as they chose. The idea that distant bureaucrats might have the power to destroy what they had built was both foreign and terrifying. What kind of laws? She asked. The kind that assume white women cannot willingly choose to live among Indians. Running Bear replied in heavily accented English, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had dealt with government policies before. The kind that say mixed communities are threats to proper civilization. The young woman who had ridden with Running Bear dismounted and approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being heard. She was perhaps 25 years old, with the kind of education that showed in her posture and speech, but also with the practical knowledge of frontier life that marked her as someone who had adapted successfully to challenging circumstances. Mrs. Harper, she said, extending her hand in greeting. My name is Sarah Whitehorse. I'm a teacher from the Indian Agency, but I'm also half Comanche through my mother's line. Chief Running Bear thought you should hear what I've learned about the new policies being considered. Margaret shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze that suggested someone who was accustomed to dealing with difficult situations. What have you learned? There are people in Washington who believe that communities like yours set a dangerous precedent, Sarah explained. They worry that if white women are allowed to choose Indian husbands and live according to tribal customs, it will undermine the entire reservation system. Benjamin's jaw tightened at her words. So they would break up families to preserve their political theories? They would call it protecting white women from savage influences, Sarah replied with bitter accuracy. They would say they're rescuing you and Annabeth from a life of degradation and danger. Annabeth, who had been listening to the adult conversation with the intensity of someone who understood that important decisions were being made, stepped forward with the kind of courage that reminded Margaret painfully of her late husband. What if we don't want to be rescued? Sarah Whitehorse smiled at the child's question, recognizing in it the heart of the entire conflict. That, young lady, is exactly what they're afraid you might say. Margaret felt the familiar surge of protective anger that had sustained her through every crisis since Thomas's death. They have no right to tell us how to live our lives. We're not harming anyone. We're building something good here. Rights are only as strong as the power to enforce them, Benjamin observed grimly. And we are few while they are many. Running Bear spoke again in Comanche, his words carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of white politics. Benjamin translated for Margaret's benefit. He says that strength comes not just from numbers, but from the righteousness of the cause. And that sometimes the best defense is to make yourself too valuable to destroy. What does that mean? Margaret asked. Sarah Whitehorse answered before Benjamin could respond. It means that you need to become indispensable to the white community as well as the Comanche community. You need to provide services that both groups value enough to fight for your right to continue providing them. Over the following weeks, the residents of Benjamin Iron Eagle's ranch began implementing a strategy that was as audacious as it was practical. Margaret established a school that served both Comanche children and the scattered white families in the region, teaching reading and writing in English while also preserving traditional knowledge and customs. Her classroom became a bridge between two cultures, proving that education could thrive without forcing students to abandon their heritage. Benjamin used his knowledge of both white and Comanche agricultural techniques to develop new methods of farming and ranching that were perfectly adapted to the challenging conditions of the Texas plains. His innovations increased crop yields and improved livestock health throughout the region, making him invaluable to neighboring ranchers who had initially viewed him with suspicion. Annabeth, with the unconscious ease of childhood, became a living symbol of successful cultural integration. She moved between English and Comanche languages without effort, participated in both Presbyterian church services and traditional ceremonies, and demonstrated that a child could embrace multiple heritages without losing her identity or her values. Transformation of their isolated ranch into a thriving community center did not go unnoticed by territorial authorities, but the response was not what anyone had expected. Instead of hostility, they encountered curiosity and eventually grudging respect from officials who had assumed that mixing cultures would lead to chaos rather than innovation. Judge William Crawford, the territorial magistrate who had been sent to investigate reports of irregular cohabitation and savage influences, arrived expecting to find evidence of the degradation that his superiors in Washington had warned him about. Instead, he found a model community where crime was virtually non-existent, children received better education than in most frontier towns, and agricultural productivity exceeded anything achieved by purely white settlements in similar terrain. "Mrs. Harper," Judge Crawford said during his official visit, his formal tone unable to hide his confusion at finding reality so different from his expectations, "I must admit that your situation here is not what I was led to believe I would find." Margaret smiled at his diplomatic phrasing, recognizing the difficulty of a man trying to reconcile his preconceptions with evidence that contradicted everything he had been taught to believe. "What were you told you would find, Judge Crawford?" "A white woman degraded by savage associations, children growing up without proper moral instruction, a community where civilized standards had been abandoned in favor of primitive customs." The judge's discomfort was obvious as he recited. Charges that seemed absurd in the face of what he had actually observed. "And what have you found instead?" Benjamin asked, his tone respectful but with an undercurrent that suggested the question was more than idle curiosity. Judge Crawford paused, clearly struggling with the implications of his honest assessment. "I have found a community where different peoples have learned to live together successfully, where children receive excellent education while maintaining respect for their various traditions, where innovation and cooperation have created prosperity that benefits everyone involved." Annabeth chose that moment to demonstrate her fluency in both languages by translating the judge's comments for the Comanche elders who had gathered to observe the proceedings. Her easy movement between English and Comanche, combined with the respectful attention paid to her translations by warriors and officials alike, provided a powerful visual argument for the success of their integrated community. Judge Crawford. Margaret said quietly, "I understand that your superiors in Washington are concerned about the precedent our community might set. But perhaps the precedent we're setting is exactly what the territory needs: proof that different peoples can live together in mutual respect and shared prosperity." The judge nodded slowly, already composing in his mind the report that would surprise his superiors and potentially change territorial policy regarding mixed communities. "Mrs. Harper, I came here expecting to order the dissolution of this settlement. Instead, I find myself wondering if this might be a model for other regions to follow." 6 months later, as autumn painted the Texas plains in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret stood once again in the doorway of her home, but this time she was not alone. Benjamin's arm encircled her waist as they watched Annabeth practice archery with Spotted Hawk, her accuracy improving with each lesson. The child had grown taller and stronger over the months, but more importantly, she had grown confident in her place in a world that had initially seemed hostile and dangerous. "Do you ever regret it?" Benjamin asked quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the magnitude of the choices they had all made. "Staying here, becoming part of this life, accepting the challenges that come with living between worlds?" Margaret leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength that had sustained her through every crisis, every doubt, every moment when the future had seemed impossible to navigate. "I regret many things," she replied honestly. "I regret that Thomas died before he could see Annabeth grow up. I regret that it took tragedy to bring us together. I regret that the world makes it so difficult for different peoples to live in peace." She paused, watching as Annabeth's arrow found its target with increasing precision. "But I do not regret choosing love over fear, hope over despair, or family over safety. I do not regret trusting a Comanche warrior who proved that honor transcends the boundaries drawn by prejudice and politics." Benjamin tightened his embrace, understanding that her words carried the weight of vows more binding than any spoken in a church or courthouse. "Then we have built something worth defending." Annabeth approached them, her bow slung across her shoulder with the casual competence of someone who had mastered a skill that connected her to generations of ancestors. "Uncle Benjamin, Spotted Hawk says I'm ready to go on my first real hunt. Can we go tomorrow?" Benjamin looked down at the child who had become his daughter in every way that mattered, seeing in her eager face the future they had all fought to create. "We can go tomorrow," he confirmed. "But remember, hunting is not just about taking life. It's about understanding our place in the world and respecting the gifts that the earth provides." "I remember," Annabeth replied solemnly. "Take only what you need, use everything you take, and always honor the spirit of what you've been given." As the sun set over the Texas plains, painting the sky in colors that reminded Benjamin of his war paint, and Margaret of the wildflowers that had grown behind her father's cabin in Kansas, the three members of their unlikely family stood together in perfect contentment. They had found something that transcended the boundaries of race and culture and convention. They had found each other. The ranch that had begun as Benjamin Iron Eagle's solitary refuge had become a beacon of hope, proof that love could bridge any divide and that families could be forged by choice as surely as by blood. In a world that too often measured worth by the color of skin or the accident of birth, they had created a sanctuary where character mattered more than heritage and where the future belonged to those brave enough to embrace both their traditions and their dreams. The little girl who had once asked desperately if she and her mother could sleep in a stable had found something far more precious than shelter. She had found a home where her questions were answered with wisdom, her fears were met with protection, and her future was limited only by her own courage and imagination. And the Comanche warrior who had once thought his fighting days were over had discovered that the most important battles were not fought with weapons, but with open hearts, extended hands, and the willingness to see family in the faces of strangers who chose to trust when they had every reason to fear. As night settled over their corner of Texas, Margaret Harper Iron Eagle, for she had taken his name in her heart, even before any ceremony made it official, knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new reasons to be grateful for the day when desperation had led them to knock on the door of a man who had answered not just their plea for shelter, but their deeper need for belonging. The promise, "Your family now," had been kept in ways none of them could have imagined, creating bonds that would endure long after the last story was told and the final lesson was learned.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.